All right, welcome back to another Saturday morning quarantine Bible study during this COVID-19 pandemic. I'm outside. I got short sleeves on. I've got my tea. This feels right. It's getting warmer up here in Canada. I am thankful for that. We can do these kinds of things outside, out in nature. It's a little bit nicer. No one around, so that's also helpful. I hope you're staying safe and that you're listening to the government wherever you're at, unless you're in Kentucky, and you could look that up. But I hope that you're staying safe, and I hope that you're staying encouraged and in the Word. I've heard back from a few people, and they've said that this has been an encouragement, so I'm thankful for that, and that's really what I'm trying to do, is just trying to be an encouragement for those who would want to be in the Word and maybe study a little bit more than what they're getting, because, it's not just Sunday morning. Of course, there's Sunday morning. That's the most important day of the week for Christians. But it's also Sunday school and Wednesday night Bible study. And, if your church does it like a Saturday morning men's Bible study or women's Bible study. And so that's why I'm doing this. I hope that it could just be an encouragement to you and maybe fill the gap in one of those smaller areas of Bible study. But here we are. In Romans chapter 1, it has been an interesting study so far. We've been looking really at this idea about what is the gospel, and that's really the theme that Paul is going to carry throughout the rest of the book, and we've discussed that. And I'd encourage you to go back and watch specifically week 1 and week 3 of these videos to really understand where we're going to be going. And I don't know how long we're going to go with these videos. I'd imagine till this pandemic has eased up a little bit, and I'm glad and I hope that you're encouraged by some of the news that's come out this last week, that it seems like the curve is being flattened and there's some good news finally, so praise the Lord for that. But we're going to continue doing these Bible studies until everything is back to at least somewhat normal and churches are able to meet once again. So, we are in Romans chapter 1. We're going to read verses 18 through, I think we'll stop at verse 25. I don't imagine to get that far. Like I said, I'm trying to keep these down to 20 minutes. I'm really watching the time this time. We'll see if we do it. All right, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what could be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So we talked about verses 16 and 17 last week, and we talked about how, yes, that's the theme that's going to be carrying through, but this is the reason why Paul is so confident in the gospel. The reason is that it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. That's amazing. That's an amazing confidence that we can have in the gospel, knowing that it's God's power, that he is the one who does the work within a man's heart, and all we have to do is preach that. And if it is God's will, they will be saved. And that's an amazing confidence that we can have. We don't have to be scared or timid in how we share the gospel. We want to be wise about how we share the gospel and building relationships and all of that. But we can be confident in knowing that it is God's power. Now, the result of that is so that we can understand what real righteousness is and obtain it. It's not just that the righteousness of God, talking about in verse 17, the righteousness of God, that it's revealed. Like I said, I'm pretty sure it was Martin Lloyd Jones who said it. If it was just the righteousness of God, meaning that God is righteous and that's what's revealed in the gospel, then it would be terrifying, because none of us fit that bill. None of us are righteous on our own. Paul is going to quote from the Old Testament in Romans chapter 3, talk about how there is none righteous, no, not one. We get that. So we need an alien righteousness, something that is from without, not within ourselves, but something from another source to be able to apply that righteousness to us, the imputed righteousness of Christ. So that's what he just talked about in verses 16 and 17. And a lot of people come to verse 18 and they go, okay, well, this is totally different. This isn't what he's talking about in verses 16 and 17. This is like in contrast to it. I don't think that's true. I think this is in direct consequence of verses 16 and 17. Now here we see that he starts, for the wrath of God is revealed. And this is the same as he said in verse 17, for the righteousness of God is revealed. Now, he's obviously trying to show a little bit of contrast between the gospel and creation, or what we can perceive just by looking around. And here we have some trees, and we have the grass, and we have animals out here in nature. And can you tell I'm glad to be outside? It's awesome to be outside. I'm so thankful. But we can look around and we can see that God exists, and we'll get into that in a moment. But there is a contrast that Paul is trying to do of showing the difference between the consequence of the gospel and the consequence of looking around at creation and the understandings that we can come to from that. That's true. But really, I think what Paul is trying to do here is answer a question. And this is something that Paul does throughout all of Romans. It's a very legal book, meaning that there's a lot of arguments. And Paul seems to write like he knows what the arguments are going to be. Now, obviously, he's inspired, so that's probably a lot of it, but also he's an intelligent man. And so he writes, and he answers questions that we would have. You know, you read one verse, you might have a question. A couple verses later, Paul is answering that question, or raising that question. And so that, I think that's what Paul is doing here, talking about the wrath of God, because the question really is, all right, well, if I'm not ashamed of the gospel of God, because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, well, what do I need to be saved from? Or maybe we could go, why do we need salvation? Right? If that's the reason why we could be confident in the gospel, then why do we need it? Why do we need salvation? Well, here's Paul's answer. Why do we need salvation? Because we have a God who's wrathful. Now, this is a subject no one wants to talk about. No one wants to talk about the wrath of God. They don't want to talk about eternal damnation. They don't want to talk about judgment for sin. Those things are uncomfortable. So a lot of people will preach Romans 1, verses 16 and 17, and then they'll jump quite a bit and maybe talk in general sense about sin going through the rest of chapter 1. But they won't stop and camp on this. But it's important. It's important that we understand that the reason why we need salvation and why God has provided salvation is because God. He is wrathful. He has wrath. What does that mean? What does it mean to have wrath? Well, for us today, we use it as like an uncontrollable anger that is just beyond. There's maybe a little annoyed, and then maybe you move into anger, and then there's like this whole other category for wrath. And that's partially true, but when we look at the Bible, the word wrath is really that word for anger. It's a justifiable anger. It's a anger that comes from a consequence of another's actions. Not just, I'm angry because something has been done to me, but it's an anger of there's something that is just wrong. it's evil, and you have wrath towards that. It's not the same as an uncontrollable anger, because if it was, then it would be a different word that we only see really used in Revelation towards the end about the wrath of God and the winepress of his wrath, and that one's an uncontrollable anger. But here it means anger, and I would even say, let me put it in here, a justifiable anger. Now, what would cause God to be angry, or to be justifiably angry? Well, it's revealed from heaven. Let's look here at the verse here. Against all, so not just some, or those pet peeves, or maybe those, as Jerry Bridges would say, those respectable sins, not just those, but all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Now, there is something we need to stop and talk about. It is revealed from heaven, and I think what Paul is trying to show is this connection about it being a justifiable anger. It's a perfect anger. It's not an anger that comes from earth or something materialistic. This is from heaven, the place of perfection, the place where God dwells, the holy place. And this wrath of God is revealed from that location. So if it's revealed from that location, it can't be sinful. It can't be something that we go, oh, well, I don't think it's right that God condemns sinners. Well, no, this is coming from a judgment place that is so above us, that is so perfect, that it's a justifiable anger. And the anger is toward or against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Now, talking about themes here, because as I've talked about in the first couple of videos here, chapter 1, we have a lot of themes that are just starting to be developed. Well, there's a theme here of justice and wrath. Not justice versus wrath, but justice and wrath, and those two coming together. There's also another theme that we see happening here about, and I'll just put it this way, maybe you don't like this term, but total depravity. The fact that man is completely sinful, totally unable to do anything about our place in the eyes of a holy God. We are completely sinful. Every aspect of who we are has been affected by sin. That is clearly something that Paul is going to develop throughout the rest of this book. And here he talks about it as ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Now notice what Paul is trying to emphasize here, just how rotten we really are. Against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And even later he's going to talk about it even more in verses 24. Their impurity to the dishonoring, there's lies involved. Throughout this whole thing, he's going to talk about how sinful we really are. And he's going to talk about it in Romans chapter 2, and Romans chapter 3 is when he's really going to hit home about the total depravity of man. So that is why God is wrathful. Because he is holy, because he is good, because he is loving, because he is just, and we are none of those things. We are sinners. We constantly sin. You probably heard it 1,000 times that we don't even need to be taught how to sin. Our little babies, who are so cute, they disobey us as soon as they can. They disobey us. They don't honor their mother and father. So we're working with Charlie about that. He's a month old now, and we're trying to get him. You need to obey. Go take a nap when we say. He's not listening. But even when they get a little bit older, right? I think the classic example is that remote and saying, hey, don't turn the channel, and they turn the channel, something like that. We get that. We're unrighteous people. We don't have to be taught. It's within our nature. Not just within our nature, it is our nature, and God is justifiably angry toward that sin. And that is revealed from heaven, a place of perfection. And how is that revealed? All right, because, we could even put it up here. We have a contrast, right? A little bit of a contrast between this righteousness of God. And how is that revealed? Well, it's revealed through, I always like putting green for the gospel. And here we have the wrath of God. And how is that revealed? Maybe you can't read that, but through creation. All right, so that's what he says here in verse 19. For what could be known about God is plain to them. All right, so not everything is plain, but what could be known about God? What are those things that could be known about him? God has shown us. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what could be known about him? His invisible attributes, namely, here we go, eternal power, 1, and divine nature, 2. All right, so anyone looking around and looking at these trees and this nature, they can know that it was made. That it was made by someone, and whoever did that had the power to make it. So there's existence. I would put that as even his divine nature and his eternal power, that he can do things. Now, is that the gospel? Is that sufficient knowledge? No, because if it was, then we wouldn't need the gospel. Everyone would just be saved. That's universalism. So we still need to get the gospel out, but there is enough there. There is enough there that people can look around and say, hey, there is a God. And what does he want from me? And what is my place in this world? Why did he make me? And they can know from that there is a difference between right and wrong, between sin and righteousness. And that is clearly shown to them. Look at this. Because God has shown it to him. In verse 19 at the end there. So it's not just that creation shows it and they should know, but God has sovereignly put this out there that everyone can know these things, and everyone does. They might say, oh, I don't get that. I wouldn't come to those conclusions, but deep down they do. Because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, look at this. This is kind of interesting. His invisible attributes have been clearly perceived. I like that. Invisible attributes clearly perceived. So the invisible God is as clear as day, and everyone should know that there is a God. And they might not say it. They might write books that say, no, I don't believe that. But at the end of the day, on their deathbed, they're going to know. And they might hide it, but they know deep within themselves. And ever since the creation of the world, so this is nothing new. This is the way it's been. Ever since the garden, this is the way it's been, that God has revealed himself, his eternal power, his divine nature, in the things that have been made. And what is the result? So they are without excuse. Who's the they? It's everyone. Everyone knows that there is a God, knows that they should not sin against this holy God, and yet we do. And so at the end of the day, you might go, I've never heard about Jesus. But at the end of the day, you know that there is a righteous God and that you've sinned against him. And that is enough for you to fall under the wrath of God in that justifiable anger, because you have no excuse. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming that you're a Christian, but on the off chance that you aren't, this is you. You don't have any excuse. You are a sinner. You know it. I know it. I know I'm a sinner. And the difference is that I believed in Jesus, that he died on the cross for me, paid the price for my sin, bore the wrath of God there on that cross, was dead, was buried, was has risen again, as we just celebrated with Easter, and is ascended on high, and I worship him for that, and I trust him completely for that salvation, that deliverance from that wrath of God, knowing that he took my place on that cross. And I hope that maybe you could say that for yourself and say, I trust that. I believe in that. And that's all that's necessary. The righteousness of God is of faith. That's all that's necessary. You just got to believe. Believe in Jesus, trust in him alone for your salvation, and you will be saved. It is a promise from God himself. He says it as much in his word. So that's where we're going to stop. 20 minutes. That's where we're going to stop. And next time we will talk about the history of sin. And hopefully we'll make it all throughout the rest of Romans chapter 1. But I hope this has been an encouragement to you. I hope that you stay safe this week, and that you wash your hands and you stay home and you do everything that the government's telling you right now. Like I said, unless you're in Kentucky, then we have some things to talk about. Just kidding, kind of. All right, have a good one. See you next time.